Hello, you're watching World Talks on TVP World. My name is Sasha Farbach. As G7 leaders gather in the French lakeside town of Evian-les-Bains, Ukraine has rapidly moved back to the center of the international agenda. U.S. President Donald Trump says he sees an opening for diplomacy after speaking with both Volodymyr Zelenskyy and Vladimir Putin, while European leaders are pushing for greater pressure on Moscow following one of the largest Russian attacks in recent months. Joining us now to discuss it all is Marcin Bużański, Director of the Center for Diplomacy and Negotiation at Collegium Civitas. Good to have you with us. Welcome.
Good morning.
All right, so we have Donald Trump in a good mood, apparently. Do you think now, with his comments about he's going to be ending this next war between Russia and Ukraine, do you think this has legs? Is this going to be now a breakthrough moment at this G7 summit?
Well, I don't think I can honestly count how many times Donald Trump has been ending that war. So I'd put a lot of caution into those statements. But it is certainly a fact that with the next stage, I would say, or let's say small progress, considering the Iran file and the possibility that the ceasefire will hold according to the deal and that the Strait of Hormuz will open, there is clearly an opening, let's say, in Donald Trump's view and on the global political agenda to focus more on Ukraine. And this is clearly the objective for European leaders meeting in France with Donald Trump. It's clearly an objective for Ukraine and Zelenskyy, who is also coming to Evian. And this creates a certain space for a new push for diplomacy, although one has to underline that under the key conditions that were blocking any progress, are still there. We are seeing a bit of a new reality with advances of Ukraine around the front line and its ability to strike into Russia. Russia is also in a tougher economic spot, although its key objectives have not changed and have not moved, and there's no indication that Putin wants to negotiate in good faith. So, as I mentioned, the underlying factors that were blocking progress on the diplomatic routes, they are still there.
Yeah, and I think also, critics, speaking of the man himself, there's these are live pictures right now we're seeing there, and our viewers, that's President Donald Trump, who's just arrived there at the G7, speaking to leaders there. I think just Zelenskyy as well recently arrived. Now you see there, Merz of Germany, Macron, Takaishi of Japan, also Carney. There's Zelenskyy now. But I mean, back to what you were saying as well, and one thing that Donald Trump has said in these last 24 hours, that he's saying that Zelenskyy and Putin are ready to meet, are ready to talk. But at the same time, Zelenskyy has pointed out that, well, Putin has rejected the face-to-face talk. So how does one reconcile these two different opinions, and what will Trump ultimately achieve?
Well, again, we have to filter a little bit the statements coming from Donald Trump. Yes, well, Putin said he will talk face-to-face with Zelenskyy, but said he has to come to Moscow, which is clearly a no-go for the Ukrainian president. So, in that sense, I highly doubt that a face-to-face meeting will happen anytime soon. Look, ultimately, the bottom line is this: Russia will not negotiate in good faith and move towards some kind of a ceasefire in Ukraine unless it is clearly forced to do so by the economic conditions and by the conditions on the battlefront. What Zelenskyy is trying to achieve now in Evian are really three things. First of all, he's looking for an additional cash injection for a rapid support to increase his capabilities to keep hitting inside Russia, to keep the advantage on the technological front, the drone warfare front, in order to use this time when he has the window of opportunity to build up that pressure, so to press his advantage. That's one. Two, get more support for Ukrainian air defenses, because as we've seen just in the last days, Russia is mercifully bombing, including UNESCO heritage sites. So these images Zelenskyy tried to sell to Trump, saying, look, be a defender of our skies, be a defender of the nations. make sure we get those Patriots. And thirdly, well, Zelensky is saying, look, this is an opportunity for you, Trump. Now you might actually press Putin much harder and have a potential for your next great deal, great success. So these are three things that Zelensky wants to achieve, and the European leaders will be also pushing Trump to do so, with one major change from the previous rounds of discussions and negotiations, that Europe is supposed to have a much stronger role on the diplomatic front. Now, how is that going to be formed? That remains to be seen. But these are the dynamics we're seeing today in Evian.
Yeah, I think on that last point, that's an interesting one. I think fairly recent, at least since Donald Trump has been at the table. Speaking of at the table of negotiating, it's always been Witkoff, it's always been Jared Kushner, who Trump has sent to Moscow. Now, with those, not just these recent attacks from the last 24 hours, but even before, time and time again, relentless Russian attacks. Do you think that that might be something that the Europeans and the rest of the G7 will push? Europe actually saying in Alma, Europe, I mean, the European leaders have said this, that they want to be more at the table also as well, looking at the interests of Ukraine and Europe. Do you think that might come out of this summit, that President Trump might agree to something of that sort?
Well, he could if he keeps having the spotlight and can be let's say, the major person to take credit if anything happens here. But the bottom line is this: it all depends on Putin, and Putin knows very well that having at this point the Europeans more engaged is not in his interest. So he'll be pushing against it. I mean, we've seen ridiculous suggestions from him, for instance, that Gerhard Schroeder be the representative of European side, of course dismissed by the others. But the discussions from Europe, I think, are moving towards not just the question of a mediator role, because that clearly is not Europe's position. Europe is a side in this conflict, and even the US is a side in this conflict, not as much as Europe, but Europe is saying we're now taking much more of the responsibility. We're providing a vast majority of the financial support, of the military support, and right now we have to make very clear that Europeans' term needs to be taken into consideration in any kind of future potential deal. And this has been agreed between Zelensky and the so-called E3, so France, Germany, and the UK recently in London. The 5-point plan or framework has been stepped out, which showed which are the lines that Europe would be expecting to defend in those negotiations and stand behind them. Now, what kind of representative format for Europe would be coined, whether it would be one representative, which was discussed but hasn't really gotten full traction, and some potential ones have stepped back. For instance, Alexander Stubb, the president of Finland, who said in these conditions he does not want to be engaged in such a role. But there's a clear sort of leadership coming up from the three main capitals, and there's an expectation that whatever shape the next stage of potential diplomatic process takes, those voices which are coined in the 5-term plan need to be at the forefront of negotiations, and this is what they'll try to convince Donald Trump to agree to and take on board.
Mm-hmm. But having said that, though, I'm just reminded we talked about this E3 last week, and I think like the Italian Prime Minister, not partial to that, Donald Tusk as well, they were not too happy that they were not invited to that critical meeting in London. So we'll have to see how that plays out. But obviously there is consensus very much on the European side on the case of Ukraine. Just briefly, I want to throw in one more topic your way, looking at the Middle East, and when we have this apparent memorandum of understanding. I mean, Trump has touted this in terms of now this is a deal that is going to be tremendously successful, but we don't know much about it yet. What do you think? This will come up, obviously, Strait of Hormuz, energy. How much is that going to be discussed at the G7, and how successful will that deal ultimately be?
It will be, of course, a very important subject, and there is a summit also held with leaders from Gulf countries, from other Middle Eastern countries who will be present in Evian. And the message is important to all the markets, and the leaders are supporting this, saying, of course, we have to have it open for maritime traffic. There needs to be a permanent opening, no more blockages. And the message to Donald Trump is we will support this even with our own resources. This is all fine, let's say on paper, fine in statements, but the harsh reality is that this is a memorandum of understanding. This is not a finalized deal. The understanding is really three things. First of all, extension of the ceasefire. Second of all, it is the US withdrawing the blockade from Iranian ports, and through a process, sort of indirect, but unfreezing some of the assets for Iran, so cash to Iran, and three, that Iran opens the Strait of Hormuz for maritime traffic. Now, this deal is at this point de facto a buying by the US of opening of the strait. I think that's the simplest way to put it. Everything else is still to be negotiated. The framework for it is set. Expectations have been narrowed, let's say, or positions have been narrowed, but the key, most difficult issues are not resolved. The nuclear program, how the uranium is going to be managed, depleted, how much Iran is going to receive in terms of rebuilding what's been destroyed in this war. Will Iran do anything about its ballistics program and missiles launchers that have been only in about 30-40% destroyed? Still a big chunk of it, the majority, 60-70%, is still available to Iran. And of course, there's the variable of what will happen between Israel and Lebanon, which is also a key sticking point here. And Israel is very unhappy about this deal and possibly will engage further in warfare. So all of this can still break down. It will be discussed in France how to keep it all in the frame of sustainability and how other countries can help in that. I think that's at the table on the discussion.
All right, so lots on the agenda there at G7. We'll, of course, cover it as it progresses. Look, thanks so much for all that. Marcin Bużański there, Collegium Civitas. Always a pleasure having you.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for watching World Talks, but stay right here for more on TVP World. Goodbye.